Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be counting down the top 10 improvements that were added in the Burning Crusade expansion. So just before we jump in, it's important to note that you really shouldn't take this video too seriously. At the end of the day, I'm just having a little bit of fun. I understand how people have very different opinions in the World of Warcraft audience, and how people may think that these changes that I'm going to talk about weren't improvements and actually had a negative effect on the game. Nonetheless, this is just my humble, harmless opinion, and I am a little bit on the fence when it comes to a few of these points. But anyway, just before jumping, please do give me a quick follow on Twitch if you want to catch any of my live streams. And anyway, let's jump into the video. So my first point is expanded class design. A lot of people have described the Burning Crusade as an expansion that very simply just built on Classic WoW's core game design by adding more core abilities, DPS abilities, fun abilities, more talents, and just overall increased depth, immersion and fun playstyle for each and every single class. Abilities that I can think of from the top of my head would be stuff like Seed of Corruption. The only real strong AoE class in Classic was the Mage, obviously, with Frost Nova and Blizzard and other things like that. But obviously Seed of Corruption was essentially a ticking time bomb explosive AoE ability, which was very fun to use. Warlocks also had Unstable Affliction, which was just another simple, very interesting ability to add to the rotation. Paladins got Crusader Strike, so they no longer just had to pop a seal and then pop Judgment and then auto attack the whole time. They had one extra button to press, which was quite nice. Shadow Priest got Vampiric Touch. You also had really cool things like Shadow Step for the Rogue, which would teleport the Rogue behind a target, which was very useful and very fun. Mages had Invisibility. They also had Spell Steal, which could steal over buffs. It could steal temporary shields, like even, you know, another Mage's Mana Shield, which was pretty cool. Druids got a really strong CC ability called Cyclone, although it's probably one of the most hated abilities in the game, especially for warriors. And Healing Druids also got Tree Form, which allowed them to feel actually more like a druid because they could actually do a little bit shape-shifting, rather than that being exclusively reserved for Feral and Moonkin and for tank. There's also a number of abilities that just kind of fixed issues. Well, you could describe them as issues or just irritating, nitpicky things for each and every class. For instance, Cloak of Shadows, which is really useful for rogues. It basically reduced all debuffs that you had on yourself, which meant that you could pop that and then pop into a Vanish. Because obviously, if you vanished when you have a dot on you, it would break the Vanish, which was a little bit irritating. There's also abilities like Ritual of Refreshment, which basically summoned a table that people could click, and when people clicked it, it gave them food rather than mages having to individually trade food with each and every single raid member. There was also a similar ability given to Warlocks to allow them to very quickly hand out health stones to every single raid member. Overall, I just think that the classes simply had more content for every player to have a mess around with. Second point I'm going to make is more raid mechanics. So it's no question that World of Warcraft's raiding has increased in sophistication and complexity as each and every expansion has been released. To illustrate this in the best way, I've decided to compare the Flamelash fight in Blackwing Lair to the Illidan fight in Blackwing Temple. So Flamelash tactics are pretty simple. Every single raid member has a stacking debuff on them, which does more and more fire damage as time goes on. When that debuff stacks too high on the tanks, they do a very simple tank swap. When it stacks too high on a melee, they walk around the corner, sit there for like a few seconds, and then go back on the boss, and that is literally it. So let's compare this to the tactics for Illidan. Every 30 seconds, a random raid member gets a debuff. They have to walk out the raid with a mage so that the mage can quickly Ice Nova and nuke the adds that spawn up from that debuff. In phase 2, the raid has to split into 3 groups to deal with the Flames of Aznaroth, which is considered one of the hardest parts of the encounter. Tanks have to kite the adds around in a specific path. Melee have to dodge these eye beams coming from Illidan, and then a random raid member will get barraged by this ability called Dark Barrage. It has to be spam healed. Then in phase 3, Illidan starts to swap between various different phases just to make it even more difficult. A Warlock with max shadow resistance gear will have to tank him, more demons spawn, and then Illidan has to be kited into Maiev Shadowsong's traps to increase the damage that he takes. It's a 16-minute long fight, and it's very, very complex compared to the average mechanics from Classic WoW. Fair enough, it is kind of unfair to compare Illidan to one of the more simpler fights from Blackwing Lair, but nonetheless, even if we compared this against Nefarian or like AQ bosses, the mechanics on every single boss really in Classic WoW is fairly limited compared to the Burning Crusade, and even like filler bosses between the big bosses in like Burning Crusade bosses had a fair amount of mechanics for you to deal with. Overall, there simply was a lot more complexity to the Burning Crusade's raid design. The third point I want to make is more viable specs. I have recently made a video about this which has a detailed look into each and every kind of meme spec from Classic WoW and how it suddenly became very viable during the Burning Crusade, if you want to look at that video later on. But what essentially happened was all the hybrid classes became more support classes. They still would do less DPS, but they'd make up for that by buffing the raid with totems or regenerating mana with Vampiric Touch, and some specs even provided very useful debuffs that would buff the DPS of the raid as well. More tanking specs became viable, so you wouldn't just see the Protection Warrior all the time, because obviously that gets a little bit boring. Protection Paladin became a really awesome AoE tank. They had their mana issues fixed with a simple talent which allowed them to regenerate their mana based on the amount that they would get healed. You also had feral tanks which became more viable because they just became a huge meat bag that was able to soak loads and loads of damage. Elemental Shamans became very useful to any ranged DPS group because they can massively boost the DPS of that group with abilities like Bloodlust, and so on and so forth. Our fourth point is gemming, which is a very simple change, but it allowed you to customize your gear and added a level of strategy involved with optimizing your character, which was a pretty welcome addition in my opinion. It added a level of thinking and theory crafting to the gearing process and overall just made it a little bit more interesting. There's something just very satisfying about there being a number of different step-to-step processes of improving your character. For number 5 we have an improved PvP system. So in vanilla the PvP system rewarded you ranks and gear based on how much time you spent playing the game. If you were able to farm 16 to 21 hours per day for 3 months, then you get the top rank and you get the best gear. Whereas in the Burning Crusade, PvP gear was rewarded for you an actual skill level in the arena in a MMR and rating system. You actually had to test your skill in a specialist environment against other players, which provided very exciting and competitive gameplay. The Honor system was totally reworked to just be a point system that you could farm in Battlegrounds in order to get you some fairly decent gear. Unfortunately, this did make Battlegrounds largely irrelevant in the Burning Crusade, but nonetheless I'm going to talk about that more in a different video. For my 6th point I have quest hubs. Vanilla had quests that led you to everywhere across the entire world, which meant that you were basically playing the walking simulator a lot of the time. This was a blessing and a curse because obviously it encouraged you to go out into the world and do some exploration, but after a while it kinda got a little bit tedious. And because you were jumping zones so often, each zone themselves also felt a little bit skimpy when it came to quests compared to the Burning Crusade. In the Burning Crusade, quests were more clumped together into areas, which means you explored each zone at a steady progressive rate, and overall each and every zone had more depth, lore and immersion because there was simply more content within the zone, whereas classic WoW zones just simply had less content inside them. The zones were more tightly packed with content, which meant you spent more time in those zones, which meant you had an increased chance of making friends within that zone because there'd normally be a dungeon attached to that zone that you can go and do, and if you're lying around in that zone just watching the general chat, there were people looking for groups and stuff like that, and there were quests that were associated with those dungeons obviously. So I think the zones in TBC just encourage you to be, well, they encourage you to have a more social experience while you were leveling up. Whereas in vanilla it may be harder for you to get a dungeon and to get some group content going because the dungeon you want to do is at the other side of the world and people just can't be bothered walking all of the way. For our 7th point we have less irritating loot. So what I mean by this is in vanilla you got shaman loot even when you played Alliance, and you could be in situations like my guild for instance where every single druid in my raid group is totally decked out in gear, so druids don't really need gear in my raid anymore, but last night 2 Cenarian tier 2 headpieces dropped, so that just became boring disenchanting loot. Obviously that can become very frustrating and in all honesty a little bit dull. In the Burning Crusade they did things a little bit differently because they had tokens that essentially could be redeemed for tier pieces and it'd be shared between 3 different classes, which meant that there was more competition but less wasted loot. And obviously each spec for each class had its own tier set, which obviously made people who play less conventional specs much happier. For our 8th point, we have Heroic Dungeons. Now, Heroic Dungeons can't be considered as a massive addition of content because I see it more as a cherry on the top to the original dungeons, as they don't really change that much. They maybe change the mechanics slightly, add a few bosses here and there like secret bosses, but on the large part they are kind of the same, just significantly more difficult. Because of their increased difficulty, I honestly think some of the Heroic Dungeons are some of the best content you can ever experience in World of Warcraft. It's really no wonder why Mythic Plus dungeons right now in retail have become so popular, because what they've essentially done is keep the content relevant to a scaled up player base. Obviously when people get better gear, the dungeons become irrelevant, but the ability to go back into a dungeon and it still be difficult is quite fun. It's important to note that these heroic dungeons actually did require keys in order for you to unlock them, and they required a massive rep grind, which leads me on to a little bit of a bonus point, that the amount of achievements required for the Burning Crusade was extensive. To get into raids, to get into heroic dungeons, and pretty much all the content had a very long attunement path, which, as has been described in previous videos that I've watched, every time you logged into the Burning Crusade you always had something to do because there was just so much to do. I mean, if you're in a situation like I am right now, I've cleared all the raids that I need to clear on Classic and I've pretty much got nothing to do. If I had cleared all the raids on the Burning Crusade, I would still have stuff to do because I could still go into heroic dungeons and farm emblems, which is my 9th point. You can very easily go without loot for about 2 months in vanilla, which has actually happened to me just fairly recently until I got Viscags, and it can be very boring and frustrating because your progression feels massively stalled by the fact you're just not getting any gear. But in Burning Crusade you had emblems, which means that you may not get any loot from the raid, but you're still farming a constant currency system which you can spend on gear, so it never feels like your progression as your character is stalled in any way, because you can farm these emblems to get a few gear pieces here and there. The gear pieces that you can get from emblems were never like huge gear pieces. You still need to go out and do your raids in order to get the best gear available to your character, but you can still fill in your gear pieces a little bit with these emblem bonuses. Overall, it just meant that you could always constantly be doing something every time you logged in order to improve your character in some way, rather than just waiting another week for you to do a raid again. The last point I'm going to mention is shamans and paladins on each faction. So this is a very welcome addition, because to be honest I probably would have played shaman if Alliance had access to a shaman race. Obviously it doesn't really make any sense at all for any of the horde races in vanilla to be paladins, or for any of the Alliance races to be a shaman. So obviously you cannot like rewrite the lore, make the lore very weird in vanilla. I'm not saying that I had that expectation of vanilla or anything like that, but nonetheless I think it is pretty cool to have every single class available for each and every faction, because it just massively increases the class diversity for each faction. But anyway guys, that is where I'm going to end the video. My name is Metagoblin. Until my next video, ciao.